Hello and good morning. One of the UK's leading doctors has said that the NHS is under more pressure now than during the peak of the pandemic. Sky News understands that at least 6 hospital trusts are currently dealing with critical incidents, which means they can't function as usual, and almost half say they're struggling to cope. The Vice President of the Royal College of Emergency Medicine, that's Dr Ian Higginson, told Sky News that the government needs to take urgent action.
No doubt whatsoever that hundreds of patients are dying unnecessarily every week because of what's going on in the urgent and emergency care sector. So several hundred patients, and those are all human beings. These are more than just statistics. And I think we have to be honest about that.
I think across all 4 nations, so in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, the pressures throughout the NHS are unsustainable, and they are now not offering any sort of standard of care that we would deem to be acceptable. So we need to do something urgently about this. And I think the first thing we need is a recognition of the state that the NHS and social care finds itself in. And I think that's why we need to have a major instance, that there's a recognition from all 4 governments that this is a situation that patients and NHS staff are finding themselves in.
Joining us for more on this is Milena Veselinovic. Milena, good morning to you. So just talk us through what kind of pressures the NHS is facing.
Good morning, Kamali. Well, we've heard about pressures on the NHS pretty much every single winter, but we've never quite heard warnings like these. The head of the Royal College of Emergency Medicine saying that up to 500 people could be dying each week because of the lack of access to emergency care. Now, another health official within the NHS said that there should be a national critical incident declared, which means that all 4 nations could coordinate to get this response right. In fact, several of the health trusts have already declared this critical incident, but basically means they can't operate as normal because of the pressure. Now, in England, 6 critical incidents have been declared, and some of those cover places like Derbyshire, Nottingham, Dorset, Hampshire, and the Isle of Wight, Buckinghamshire, and Staffordshire. And at least 55 NHS trusts have publicly stated they're struggling to cope with the demand for their services. Now, we've also heard from the interim president of NHS providers, Saffron Quadri, saying that this is all due to lack of investment over a long period of time, worn out workforce, lack of staffing. She's saying that there should be more investment in public health and prevention that would stop people from needing the NHS services and emergency care in the first place.
OK, Milena, thank you very much for that. Well, joining us now is Matthew Taylor, Chief Executive of the NHS Confederation. Good morning to you, Matthew Taylor. Thank you very much for being with us. So that figure that Dr Adrian Ball mentioned of up to 500 people dying each week as a result of delays in their care, is that accurate, do you think?
Well, I don't think anyone knows exactly what that figure would be, but there's no question that when the NHS is under the kind of pressure that we're under right now, that there are consequences in terms of harms and risks for patients. And the fundamental issue here is that we are still, as a health service, in a position of fragility. And it's important to say we don't always have winter crises. There was a time when we'd had sustained investment over several years, over a decade ago, when it was not usual to have a winter crisis in the NHS. But then we had the 10 years of austerity. That meant we went into COVID in a fragile state, and that meant COVID hit us harder, our health service and other health services. It meant that, for example, we had a bigger increase in people waiting for. So we went into this winter knowing we're in a fragile state. I don't think anyone was under any illusions that it would be difficult. If you then get what we've seen, which is a huge growth in flu and people who are frail and vulnerable in hospital with flu, and also the impact that the flu has on our own staffing, then I'm afraid you get to the situation we're in, which is that most parts of the health service, and we focus on hospitals, but this is true of mental health services, community services, primary care, are under almost unbearable strain. And that does mean that we're not able to provide services as usual. We have to focus all our energies on the most urgent and intense needs. And that's why you're seeing the declaration of critical incidences in so many places.
Are you saying that those years of austerity have essentially broken the NHS?
I don't think there's much doubt about that. We had half as much growth in health spending as we, health economists around the world, when they look at a country like Britain with an ageing population, will say that we need growth of around 4% a year, and we had growth of around 2% a year for a decade. And that meant we went into the COVID crisis, 30–40 billion pounds less spending than other comparative countries. We went in with 100,000 vacancies. We went in with very low capital spending, so we don't have the buildings, we don't have the equipment that we need. We're not as productive as we could be. And I think the really difficult thing is this today. What I'd like to say is this: that during COVID, we absolutely said, didn't we, that we wanted to learn the lessons from COVID when we saw the way that the health service responded, but also the way in which the health service had to stop doing almost everything else. And we wanted to learn those lessons. But yet we've gone into this winter in an even greater sense, with an even greater degree of fragility than we went into COVID. And we can see the consequences. So what we have to do, this winter is going to be extremely difficult. What we have to do is do everything we can to try to minimize harms and risks this winter. And one of the things that is vital is that as ministers return to their desks, we do need to see a resolution to the industrial action that threatens 4 more days of strike action in January. And then when we have got through the winter, because in the end, the NHS will get through, even if we have to get through in ways which are very, very difficult for us and for patients and for the public, then we've got to have a conversation about what we need to do to not go into next winter in the same position of fragility that we've gone into this one.
I mean, how does the industrial action get resolved, though? Because you'll know that while it's about conditions, a large part of it is also about pay. And the argument, of course, is that if you pay staff more, then you don't have enough money for other parts of the service.
Well, we need leadership. I understand the government's position, limits on public spending, worries around inflation. I absolutely understand the trade union's position, which is around the fact that their members have taken real pay cuts, that we have a crisis in recruitment, retention and motivation in the health service, over 130,000 vacancies. So in a sense, I understand why both sides would say, well, we're not going to move, but this is why we need leadership. We need to look at what's unfolding in the health service today. We need to recognise that January is the toughest month for the health service. And government needs to be willing to negotiate in the right spirit, and trade unions need to be willing to enter into those negotiations, because to put 4 days of industrial action on top of what you're hearing about today, then we will absolutely increase those risks and harms to patients. There is no question. And so we need people to be, we need politicians, the trade unions to be pragmatic, to be creative, to find a way through this, not to heap extra pressures on a system that is hardly coping right now.
OK, so what does that pragmatism look like then, Matthew? Do you want politicians to negotiate over pay? You pointedly didn't mention pay when you talked about negotiating. And do you want to see trade unions bring down some of their pay demands?
Well, look, this is the way negotiation works. Both sides have got a starting point. But it does look at the moment as though the reason we can't make any progress at all is that the government will not negotiate about pay. And as long as the government refuses to negotiate about pay, I don't see the trade unions entering into negotiation. Now, clearly, when the trade unions enter into negotiation, it's a negotiation. They move from their starting point. That's how it works. But at the moment, there's no conversation going on. People are adopting fixed positions. And as long as they adopt those fixed positions, we continue to walk into 4 days of industrial action. Now, your report has vividly described the pressures we're under now. January is our toughest month. The idea that we can then take 2 days of nurses' strikes, 2 days of ambulance staff strike, on top of all of this, without there being major implications for patients, well, it's a fantasy. There will be more harm. There will be more risk.
I mean, what's it going to look like then after those extra 4 days of industrial action this month as services facing the winter pressures?
Well, it will look different in different places. And we will once again have to ask the public to support us. So in the last ambulance dispute, we saw a significant reduction in 999 calls. Now, we're grateful to the public for doing that. But whilst it's always important that the public use the health service in the right way, if you are worried about your health, then use 111, use the NHS website, use primary care, only ring 999 if you have a life-threatening emergency. The problem is, as we saw during COVID, that if people stop using the health service because they think it's not there, and there's reports today in Scotland about this, then all that happens is that those illnesses worsen and that we build up more pressures for the future. So the situation we're in now, where it's difficult for the NHS to cope, where so many parts of it having to declare critical incidents, we're not able to provide the range of services. Well, that's a problem here and now for people who are having operations cancelled, waiting for ambulances. But it's also a problem for the future because it means that we as a population become sicker, and that drives future pressures. So look, the government has provided extra money to help get people out of hospital because, as you know, one of the issues we've got is over 10,000 patients in hospital who don't need to be there. But that money was announced late, it was distributed even later. And so it's not been able to make much difference this year. What we've got to do when we've got through this winter somehow is we've got to think about how we invest money and how we do things differently so that we don't enter next winter in the same position of fragility. And that's what I would say to people. Help us to get through these difficult times, but also heap pressure on the government to act in ways which mean that we don't have to feel this way this time next year.
So look, new year, new week, new start. What's your message to the Health Secretary and to the leaders of the unions to try and get this thing resolved? Because no one wants to see those strikes take place again in a couple of weeks' time.
I think I want to say this is an extraordinary time. I speak to NHS leaders, just about every day, and a lot of them, if not most of them, say that this is the toughest winter they've dealt with. We cannot go on like this. We can't be sitting here next year saying, well, this is even tougher than last year. So we need, with the support of the public and others, to get through this difficult time. And I call on the trade unions and government to find a way of getting through this stopping this industrial action taking place. But then we mustn't get used to this. We mustn't be in a situation we somehow accept that the NHS being in this kind of position of critical incidents, crisis and winter is inevitable in a country as rich as ours, with the health service, with the strengths that we've got. If we have the resources, we can do remarkable things, as we showed during COVID, as we've shown to the vaccination programme. One of the sad things about the kinds of pressures we're under now is that we're not able to make the progress we did make before the winter in reducing the number of people waiting a long time for operations, in accelerating our diagnostic services. So the health service can do the job if it's given the resources and the support to do so. But at the moment, the fundamental capacity issues are in danger of getting worse. As I said, we went into COVID with 100,000 plus vacancies. We've now got 130,000 plus vacancies. So what we need is a national plan once we've got through the worst of this winter, and a national plan geared towards that absolute commitment that we will enter next winter in a more resilient state.
Okay. Matthew Taylor, Chief Executive of NHS Confederation, thanks for your time this morning.
Thank you.
For being with us. Now, of course, the crisis in the NHS dominates the newspapers this morning. This is the front page of the Daily Mirror, quoting the head of the Royal College of Emergency Medicine, saying that delays could lead to 500 deaths a week. That warning from Dr. Adrian Boyle is also the front page lead of the Daily Express and for the Times, which talks about staff shortages, surgery backlogs, flu and COVID all contributing to the crisis. Now, The Guardian predicts that NHS strikes could continue for months, with staff facing real terms pay cuts. Off that, the Eye reports that 70% of Conservative voters think the party has mismanaged the health service, while the Daily Mail calls it a triple New Year headache for Rishi Sunak, throwing in migrant crossings and rail strikes. The Daily Telegraph reports that the Prime Minister has shelved plans for an overhaul of the childcare system. They've also got the NHS story beneath the fold. The Sun reports on the publication of Prince Harry's book, and the Star's headline is Barking Mad, which is a story about councils spending millions of pounds on trees, some of which die because they're not planted properly. Now, in other news this morning, the mayor of Kyiv, Vitaly Klitschko, says that another night of drone attacks across the city have caused power outages. Meanwhile, across the border in Russia, the governor of Bryansk said that Ukrainian drones have damaged a power supply facility overnight, cutting off electricity. Let's bring in Yusra El-Bayir, who's joining us from the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. Yusra, good morning to you. So just tell us, what's been the situation there overnight with these strikes on infrastructure?
Yeah. Good morning, Kamali. I mean, just before midnight, air raid sirens sounded, and then shortly after, less than 30 minutes after, there was one loud explosion, and then followed by a series of smaller blasts that could be heard over the next few hours. And now today they're saying that 20 aerial targets were struck overnight, and the mayor has actually put out just now that a 19-year-old was wounded in the northeastern part of the capital after a damaged drone, fell and hit him. And this is 2 days now of a relentless bombardment by Russia. This has come after Putin gave a 9-minute New Year address on Saturday, on New Year's Eve, accusing the West of lying and provoking Moscow to launch this special military operation in Ukraine. And now Ukrainians are starting the first 2 days of the year. New Year's Eve saw 20 missiles, according to the Air Force, launched into Ukraine. 12 of them were intercepted. One person killed here in the capital. And just 2 days prior, 69 missiles, the Air Force said, were launched into country. 54 of those were intercepted, and some of those hit homes in Kyiv. This is a very strong message from Moscow coming into the new year that the campaign here in Ukraine will not end.
Okay, Yusra, for now, thank you. All right, let's take a little look at some other stories that are making news this morning. And this week is going to see more strikes across the rail network. Thousands of workers represented by the RMT are going to take part in 2 48-hour walkouts affecting journeys from Tuesday until Saturday. Train drivers represented by the ASLEF union will also be on strike on Thursday, and the West Coast Main Line is closed north of Carlisle because of flooding. More than a third of adults in the UK would find it difficult or impossible to cover a £20 increase in their monthly spend. Research from the charity Citizens Advice also found that around 3 in 10 are losing sleep at least once a week because of worry about their finances. And a growing number of people are said to be resorting to DIY medical treatment because they can't get a face-to-face appointment with their GP. A survey commissioned by the Lib Dems found that 1 in 4 adults tried and failed to get a consultation in 2022. All right, time for a look at the day's weather, and the Met Office has issued a warning for ice in Scotland, Northern Ireland and the north of England. More to come.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
It will be mainly dry and settled today, but it will be colder than recently, and there's rain heading in on Tuesday. It'll be a dry start, apart from some mainly coastal showers, but it'll be chilly with a frost in the north and the west. There'll be some freezing fog and some icy stretches. The morning will stay mostly fine and dry, although a few showers will continue in the northwest and near Channel Coast, but early fog will linger in some places. It will be colder for most, with light winds, but it should feel pleasant enough. The afternoon will bring not much change, but the west of Ireland will see the wind picking up ahead of evening rain. Ireland, Northern Ireland and Northern Britain and Western Britain will turn wet and windy overnight.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Let's get more now on our top story, the crisis in the NHS. Doctors warn that hundreds of people are dying every week because of pressure on the service. Well, Sky News has learned that 6 critical incidents are currently in place across NHS trusts in England, meaning they can't function as usual due to the pressure they're facing. These critical incidents cover Derbyshire, Nottingham, Dorset, Hampshire, the Isle of Wight, Buckinghamshire and Staffordshire, and at least 55 NHS trusts have publicly stated that they are struggling to cope with the demand for their services. Well, joining us now is Dr Onkar Sahota, a GP and Labour member of the London Assembly. Dr Onkar Sahota, good to have you with us and good morning to you. So just describe the pressures that you and your colleagues are facing.
Look, good morning. We've heard, as you heard, that the 55 trusts are under special stress. General practice and the out-of-hours services have been under unprecedented pressure. The NHS is in a state of crisis, and this is not just winter, right? Well, winter, of course, made it worse with a huge rise in cases of flu and COVID. But also, this is a 12-month crisis in the NHS, and we need to do something about this.
And you say do something about this. What needs to be done?
Well, look, first of all, I think we need to know that this has been a result of political decisions taken over many, many years and over the last 12 years particularly. And we need to sit down and really say how we're going to sort the NHS out. And this needs a government who is prepared to invest money in the NHS, but also to talk to the professionals to see what's demoralizing them, what's their pressures, and for the Secretary of State for Health to take responsibility and talk to the nurses and doctors who are on the front line.
Now, we know there's, of course, pressures on all parts of the service, but I wonder about doctors specifically. There's often talk about doctors doing a 7-day work week, and that's often been rejected. I mean, why is that? Wouldn't that alleviate some of the pressure?
Well, look, the doctors do work all the time, and I think that even doctors are human beings. They can only do a certain number of hours. But I mean, I know, for example, in hospitals where shifts, right, should have 4 doctors, and then you have 1 doctor covering that shift. We have general practice, which is scheduled. We have a vacancy of something like 20,000 GPs, or sorry, doctors in this country, and 100,000 nurses. So there's huge vacancy rates. And doctors and nurses can only work a certain number of hours within their safety limits. We limit the number of hours an airline pilot will fly. We limit the number of hours which a lorry driver will drive. But why do we think the doctors can work 7 days a week, 24 hours?
So doctors shouldn't work extra hours, that's what you're saying?
I think doctors are already working extra hours. How many hours can they work is the limit, right? I think doctors are already working 50, 60 hours, right? Okay? Although GP surgeries may be only open for from 8 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. Monday to Friday, but there's some GPs are the ones who are providing out of our service in the weekend and the evenings. Those doctors aren't coming. Those doctors aren't just reserved for evenings. These doctors also work during the daytime also. So doctors are doing extra shifts over the weekends to cover weekend out of our services. So I think they're really working very hard.
Now, Doctor, you know that junior doctors are going to be balloting in a couple of weeks' time about their strike action. Would you support your junior colleagues going out on strike at a time like this?
I never support a government not talking to the profession, to the frontline doctors and nurses. It was the Secretary of State who refused to talk to the nurses. Why is it that doctors and nurses whose job is to look after the sick and health and people in health are having to take strike action? What is happening in the system that's forcing these people to take this industrial action? And I think the answer is that there's a government which isn't listening to them. It's only in those circumstances that the professionals are being pushed to have the voice. And what is this strike action all about? It's about patient safety. If there aren't enough doctors and nurses on the wards, they're saying to the public, we can't provide a service that is required of us. And that's being honesty with the public. We've only heard yesterday that 500 people are dying unnecessarily every week due to waiting times. What does it mean by the system? The public needs to know this, and the government needs to react to it.
Yeah, and with all due respect, Dr. Sahota, my question was specifically about your junior doctor colleagues who are going to ballot for strike action in the next couple of weeks. And my question was, would you support junior doctors walking out at a time like this for the health service?
I support junior doctors in raising their concerns, and I support these doctors and the government to sit down. I'm not going to say or criticise my colleagues for raising the voice of concern to the government. I'm not going to criticise them for that, but I'm sure these decisions can be prevented. The government can sit down with the doctors and nurses, and they can prevent this strike action.
OK, Dr. Onkar Sahota, do appreciate your time this morning, sir. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you much. Thank you. Good morning.
All right, let's take a look at some other stories that are making news this morning. And Pope Benedict XVI will lie in state from today ahead of his funeral on Thursday. Benedict was the first pope to resign in over 6 centuries, which means that his funeral will be different from many previous for a Catholic leader, in that it will be led by his successor. Now, an aide to the Pope claimed that Benedict's final words were, "Lord, I love you." Croatia has started the new year by officially adopting the euro as its currency. The nation joined the European Union nearly a decade ago, but had to wait until now to qualify as a Eurozone country. From midnight on New Year's Eve, Croatia also entered the Schengen zone, meaning no more border ID checks and free movement between the 27 member states. Now, 4 people have died in a mid-air helicopter crash in Australia, with a further 3 seriously injured. Police confirmed that the 2 aircraft collided near the SeaWorld resort on the Gold Coast on Monday afternoon. Investigators are now looking at the incident. Now, to perhaps the greatest footballer who ever played the game. Pele's body is going to lie in state at the Santos Stadium, where he played for almost his entire career and scored some of his most memorable goals. Jackie Beltrão has more from Brazil.
Just a few hours from now, the doors behind me at the Vila Belmiro Stadium, the Santos Football Stadium, will open, allowing the fans who've queued overnight to walk in and file past the coffin of the man they call King Pelé. He's going to be lying almost in state here on the football pitch where he played all of his football from a 15-year-old boy right up to when he went to the States and retired. He will stay here at the football stadium for 24 hours before the coffin will be taken through the streets of Santos. His career here lasted 19 seasons. He won 26 titles, and lots of big clubs in Europe were desperate to sign him, particularly after that 1958 World Cup win, when as a teenager he just took the world by storm. But they couldn't sign him. United tried, Juventus tried, Inter Milan tried, but the Brazilian government declared him an official national treasure that could never be exported out of the country. He is so loved here in Brazil and adored here in Santos. It's going to be a very emotional day.
Jackie Beltrao reporting. Now, Australia is reviewing its visa and immigration system as it tries to rapidly increase its workforce. Ever since the country shut its borders due to COVID, there haven't been enough people to fill the jobs needed to keep the economy growing. Nicole Johnston reports now from Sydney.
Australia is in the grip of a severe worker shortage. Even beneath the sails of its most iconic site. Desperate demand for chefs, bartenders, baristas. The list goes on. When COVID struck, foreigners fled. Now Australia wants them back. Up for grabs, £500 sign-on bonuses.
We've got a couple of fine dining restaurants and we can't open certain days because we just don't have enough staff, and that's across the industry. It's like that.
Competition for talent is tight and poaching staff is rife.
Hello there, ladies. I've got 2 espresso martinis.
How is it finding a job here?
There's jobs everywhere, up and down the coast. Everyone is crying out for staff at the moment.
What about the pay?
The pay is amazing. Yeah, compared to at home, there is a big difference.
The difference is double. Hundreds of miles from Sydney, fruit picking pays up to £300 a day. But there's no one to do it.
These trees should have been picked about 3 months ago. Couldn't get enough fruit pickers, so we just left them on the trees, and now they're just falling off on the ground.
A year of work, £140,000 of fruit left to rot. Unemployment is at its lowest level in nearly 50 years. So the government is planning to overhaul the entire visa system and allow in an extra 35,000 permanent migrants.
1 in 3 businesses are desperate for staff. The country needs hundreds of thousands of new workers fast. Without them, Australia won't be able to keep up the extraordinary growth of its economy.
Also wanted, skilled labour. People to fix cars, build houses and take jobs in mines, hospitals and schools. No regrets here, swapping North Yorkshire for the Sydney summer.
Went to see my friend's family, which was absolutely great, but then it kind of put the nail in the coffin for me. It was just, the life isn't as good as here at all.
In what way?
So just the aspect, the cost of living, it's just going through the roof at the minute. You can see people aren't that happy. And even now, there's more and more of my friends what are actually migrating, travelling Asia and coming to Australia for this life, for the beach, everything.
Strong wages, countless jobs, a healthy economy. All that's missing are the workers. Nicole Johnston, Sky News, Sydney.
Time for a look through the morning's newspapers, and with us to review them is the editor of The Big Issue, Paul McNamee, and the broadcaster, Thomas Copeland. But before we hear from them, let's take a look through the front pages. And we'll start with the front page of the Daily Mirror, which quotes the head of the Royal College of Emergency Medicine, who said delays in care could be killing 500 patients a week. That warning from Dr Boyle also makes the front page of the Daily Express. The Times also makes it their front page story, and they mention the staff shortages, surgery backlogs, flu and COVID all contributing to the crisis the service is facing. The Guardian predicts that NHS strikes could continue for months, with staff facing real terms pay cuts. The Eye reports that 73% of Conservative voters think the party has mismanaged the health service. The Daily Mail calls it a triple New Year headache for Rishi Sunak, throwing in migrant crossing and rail strikes too. The Telegraph reports that the Prime Minister has shelved plans for an overhaul of the childcare system, and they've got the NHS story on the front page too. The Sun reports on the publication of Prince Harry's new book, while the Star's headline is Barking Mad, a story about councils spending millions of pounds on trees, some of which die because they haven't been planted properly. All right, let's bring our guests in, Thomas and Paul. Guys, thanks for being with us again. Let's go inside the papers now, and we're going to start with you, Thomas. You picked out this story, page 6 of The Guardian, about Extinction Rebellion. Talk to us about that.
This is in quite a few of the papers as well. Extinction Rebellion, a group made famous for, its really disruptive forms of protest. You'll remember people gluing themselves to the gates of Buckingham Palace. Lots of extensive disruption in Piccadilly Circus, Oxford Circus, bank headquarters and newspapers being, paint on windows being smashed. That's what made this group famous. They've issued a statement yesterday entitled "We Quit," saying that it wants to move away from that highly disruptive form of protest. Brilliant quote, they want to prioritize attendance over arrest and relationships over roadblocks. They admit in the piece, in the statement, that it's a controversial move, especially with the people who supported and have supported Extinction Rebellion, precisely because it was engaged in that kind of highly disruptive protest, a lot of young people. I can't help but feeling there's probably a lot of politics underneath the surface here. Extinction Rebellion always prided itself on being a decentralized organization, but that's not to say, and it's always the case, that there's great and very dynamic power struggles going on here. You also feel as if, is this an organization that's been outflanked by the likes of Just Stop Oil, another similar protest group that's made famous over the last couple of months by throwing soup at works of art across the UK. It feels a little bit like what Extinction Rebellion is trying to do here is just move themselves into being a much more mainstream organization. They talk about building relationships inside and outside power. That feels like it's an organization that once it moves itself into the mainstream, the kind of action in which it was engaged was always a bit of a trade-off. You were trading in the headlines that you gained, the extra publicity, more people talking about these issues of climate change, and in exchange, you annoyed a certain number of people. I wonder whether Extinction Rebellion now feels it's got to a tipping point where the balance is no longer in its favour. This article quotes a YouGov poll that says that the organisation is disliked by more people than it is liked. Is this a move towards trying to become a much more mainstream player? Aware of the fact that new organizations like Just Stop Oil, there will always be a new organization to outflank where you're standing, and they want a more permanent position. Interestingly, that Just Stop Oil and Insulate Britain, which I believe are spin-offs of Extinction Rebellion, have not said they're going to stop their direct action, so that will continue. So it is a fascinating move, Thomas, and thanks for bringing us that. Paul, let's go to you, and you picked up this story also in The Guardian as well about bus fares. And on the face of it, a £2 sort of flat fee for bus fares sounds great, but there might be a wrinkle in that.
Yeah, very much. And I think bus provision and public transport provision is one of the quiet crises across Britain at the moment. This story relates to a 3-month rollout of 60 million money to cap bus fares at £2, as you say, across about 4,500, which is great. A lot of them in rural southwest and northeast where bus provision is not great. However, the warning comes from Campaign for Better Transport that says once this runs out, and it will run out around the same time as additional provision to help public transport post-COVID, that there is a risk of up to 20% of bus services going away of all flesh and being no longer there for people. And I think this is a real problem, because bus services, particularly in places of deprivation and in rural areas where there's not always a lot of investment, are essential, not just for key workers who frequently need to use them, but for pensioners or people who don't necessarily have private transport. And when that comes away, it stops the engines of commerce working in those areas, and also just being able to get a big issue. It gets a big reaction. And there is a possibility to do something about it. If you look at Andy Burnham in Greater Manchester bringing some services back into public ownership, or in Scotland, where if you're under 21 and under, you get free bus use. Things can be done if there's a will, but again, this just feels like a lack of proper joined-up thinking from Westminster. It's good that they've got this, but they haven't thought a little further down the road, literally.
Literally. All right, Thomas, let's turn to you now. And you've got this story here in the Express about Amazon. And I'll let you give us all the detail of this. I don't think viewers will be very surprised when they hear what you've got to say.
Well, that's right. It's a typically depressing and predictable story. So Amazon launched Amazon Aware earlier on in the year, a whole line of everyday products that they said would be the eco-friendly choice. You can just about see the logo there on your screen. They've replaced the A in Aware with a leaf, which is a classic move, but it's plagued by many of the same issues that we see in the way that online shopping works much more broadly. A Telegraph investigation found that items were still wrapped in single-use plastic. They were being imported from all over the world. Now, Amazon says that it does carbon offsetting for all of these products. That typically means donating or finding financially supporting initiatives elsewhere to try to offset some of that carbon use, planting trees, cleaning up the oceans, etc. The big headline, I suppose, in here in most of these papers is the Green Party peer, Jenny Jones, calling this greenwashing on a grotesque scale and saying that this carbon offsetting doesn't work. Now, to be fair to Amazon, it's a fairly limited investigation, and this is a new line of products, but here's a New Year's resolution maybe for consumers that want to engage in a more eco-friendly choice. You've got to look at the fine print. If you want to make these decisions, then just make sure that the people that you're going to try to get these eco-friendly choices are actually, you know, seeing this through all the way down the supply chain. That's a major problem with Amazon. There's potential here, and clearly they understand the fact and are at least to a certain extent capitalizing monetarily on the fact that people want to go for these more eco-friendly choices. But I think consumers are smart as well, and they cotton on pretty quickly when they find that these initiatives actually don't work, and they realize the places that they want to go to or don't want to go to for an eco-friendly choice. So eventually, I think Amazon will need to iron out all of these kinks. Consumers won't be, you know, they won't have the wool pulled over their eyes for that much longer. There's your New Year's resolution. Look at the fine print.
Absolutely right. Always worth looking at the fine print if you can face it. And sticking with the sort of theme, Paul, your story here in the Daily Telegraph has got a bloke who is a genuine eco-champion. Tell us about this.
Yeah, this is a positive story for the new year.
Excellent.
There's been a lot of negative stories, but this is a good story. And I liked it also because it's from a part of the world that I know well in North Antrim. It's a fellow called Stuart Hood who has planted 20,000 trees, 20,000 of them, on a 22-acre site just outside Antrim. He's put in some native beech oak, and he's then going to put in some pine. I guess he doesn't have to do it. He's got a bit of a grant to do it, but it's a good thing that there are people who are trying to plant trees when we need as many trees as we can, and also bring in a little biodiversity, because it also says that his son has put some beehives in the area and they're looking to keep some wetland within the area as well. So there are these pockets of positivity of people doing the right thing and trying to make the world better for all of us. Let's hope that it's not just in North Antrim, outside of Antrim town, but across the rest of Britain. But for now, I am celebrating somebody in Northern Ireland doing something well.
Yeah, and well worth celebrating. And I'm sure it is happening in other areas, but it's really good to see that someone is planting trees and bringing back these kind of areas. Good for the wildlife and good for us too. Right, Thomas, Paul, thanks both very much.